Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first in a series of lessons on how we can write and develop our content more effectively by using some strategies that we will be covering. Before we begin, please make sure that you are seated comfortably and attentively, and that you give your full and undivided attention to this video. At any point in the video, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to raise your hands, and your teacher will pause the video and address your question. Without further ado, let's get started with today's lesson, Lesson 1, on how we can write more relevantly to address and develop the theme, subject, or topic of the story that is given to us. Let's begin by looking at a typical example we might encounter. In PSLE, this would be the kind of a story that you would encounter. What would you do when you look at the question paper for the first time? What are the steps that you would take? Today, we will cover a very simple approach that can help you to tackle this question in a structured and systematic way, meaning you will not forget any important and crucial point about this question. Let's begin with the theme. Now, the theme is the topic of the writing, and it is usually in bold. Now, what do I mean by in bold? That means that the words in the question are darker than the rest. You will notice that in this particular question, the bolded words are something that was lost. Something that was lost, therefore, is the theme or the topic of my writing. And that's the most important thing to take note of, because if I do not write my story according to the theme, then I am writing out of point or out of the scope of what this writing task is asking me to write about. Next, I will look at the picture. There are 3 pictures on the right. And my advice to all candidates is that you choose 1 out of the 3 pictures. Why 1, not 2 or 3? The simple point is, the more pictures you choose, the more restricted and narrow your story will be. The less you choose, preferably 1, the broader and the wider you can write, meaning you'll have more to think about and more to write with less pictures. So I would typically advise all candidates, all students, to write using 1 picture that you can then link effectively to the theme or topic that's presented to you, right? So there should be a very clear link between the theme and the picture. And this link must take place in your story, and it must be clearly presented to your readers. Later on, we'll explore which part of the story this link can take place and how we can make this link very clear to our readers. Let's move on. What other elements of this picture, what other elements of this question are important? Well, obviously, the guiding questions below, right, help us to develop the theme or the topic. In this case, what was lost? How did it get lost? And was it found? How was it found? These are some guiding questions, either stated explicitly on the question or in your head, that can help you to develop the theme or the topic more fully. Now, it is very important that for any question that you encounter, you make a very clear identification of the theme and you understand it fully. In this case, the theme is something that was lost. So my story must center around something that was lost, how I felt about that loss, and how I recovered that item or that object, if I recovered it at all. So the entire story must revolve around the theme, and in the process of that story developing, the picture that I choose must appear very obviously in my story. So in this case, the simplest form the story can take is the loss of a mobile phone in a park during an activity I'm engaged in, as well as the consequences of that loss, my feelings, the inconvenience or embarrassment that that loss would cause me, as well as a clear and explained reason for the recovery of that item. Right? So let's take a look at some key terms that I've covered. First of all, theme. What is a theme? Now, I've already mentioned a theme is a topic or a subject that's given to us. In this case, the theme is something that was lost. But it's useful for us to understand what this word theme, which I use, means, because this will give us some ideas about what then is expected of us when we write according to a theme. So once again, what is a theme? A theme is the subject of a talk, a piece of writing, or anything at all that we view, or read, or listen to, or watch. So a subject that goes through something that we watch or read or listen to or encounter. It is an idea within that piece of work that recurs and pervades. So what do I mean by recurs and pervades? Well, recurs is simply a fancy way of saying repeated. So the idea must be repeated throughout my story so that it becomes noticeably common, meaning I can see it everywhere I look in the story. In this case, something that was lost, every part of my story should point in some way to something being lost or something being found, because that is the central idea or theme of my story. It must repeat itself throughout the story. And I'll show you in a practical way how this happens later. It's important for us to link the theme to the story that we are about to write. It would be disastrous if we write a story that is totally unrelated to the theme or topic. Then again, like I mentioned earlier, we would be writing out of point or off topic or off the theme. Next, a theme pervades, right? So a theme recurs, meaning it repeats throughout the story. And secondly, a theme pervades, meaning it's everywhere, right? It fills up the entire story. It's part of everything that I read in the story. So repeating and being present throughout the story, they're related ideas, right? And that's what I, as an author and a writer, ought to do. I should take that main idea and try to make sure that it happens all throughout my story and not just restrict that theme to one part of my story. Then the other parts of my story would no longer be relevant or on point or on topic anymore. So it's very important to think and to plan, therefore, before we write our story. Which brings me, therefore, to what a good story is. A good story is one in which the theme or the main idea or the topic of that story repeats throughout the story in all its different parts and is found everywhere I look. What does that look like? And how do I make sure that this happens in my story? Well, it begins by working with a simple structure that all stories usually follow. So, to answer your question, how do I make this theme or this main idea happen again and again and again throughout my story? I use, first of all, a structure like the story mountain to build my story up so that I know which parts to insert my theme into. Now, if you remember, you would have learned this in primary 3 and primary 4 in particular, when you started writing narratives. The story mountain begins with an exposition, which is something like an introduction. Then it moves upward into a rising action, which is when the problem of the story is introduced to the readers. Then it escalates or moves up even further into the climax, where the problem often gets worse or the problem spreads its effect to more people. And finally, it comes down into the falling action, where solutions and strategies are used in order to solve that problem. So falling action is where the problem is solved. And finally, resolution or conclusion is when the story ends, usually with the character reflecting on the series of events that happen and learning lessons that have come out of this experience. So if you follow this very simple arc or mountain of a story, you will find that you know which parts you can insert the theme in and which parts you can connect the theme and the picture to. So let's take a look. How do I make the theme recur and pervade. First, I start by planning my story. So in the case of something that was lost, I will use that theme in a moment to demonstrate to you how I plan my story in my head in 1 or 2 minutes, very quickly, without too much detail, with just the main ideas. Then after I plan the story, I'll start to link my main ideas together, right? So that I can connect these ideas into the flow that makes up the story mountain. And finally, I put in my picture, the picture I have chosen, into usually either the rising action over here or the climax over here of my story. And it is very important that I do that very consciously so that I don't forget when I'm writing and I'm carried away with the flow of my story. I won't forget to insert that critical picture, because if I don't insert any of the pictures, then my content will be penalized heavily. So I must remember, first of all, to make sure that my main idea is happening throughout all the different parts of the story mountain. Then, secondly, I need to remember to put in my picture. Usually, my picture fits into the rising action. It usually represents the problem, very much like something that was lost, where the first picture we chose was one of a mobile phone left unattended on a park bench. That represents the rising action or the problem of the story. It could also happen in the climax where the problem gets worse. For example, in the case of the second picture, where the boy walks towards an information counter, perhaps in desperation, because he could not find the item he had lost. So the problem escalates, gets worse, or becomes more serious. So usually, when we insert the picture into our story, we insert it at 2 points. One, the rising action, where the problem first presents itself, or two, at the climax, where the problem gets worse. And that's usually where we can spend a lot of our time developing our story with the reaction of the characters, the feelings, the emotions, right? And the scene and the setting that adds to the predicament or the problem that the character is facing in our story. All right, back to the flow. After we have linked our picture into our rising action or climax, then now comes the time for us to look at the overall plan of our story and make sure that each part of it is relevant to the theme. I will show you what that looks like in the following example. Take a look with me now at this story mountain that I built using the theme of something that was lost. Notice that the picture of the phone unattended on a park bench occurs in rising action, my point number 2, right? This is where the picture occurs. And I can spend some time in my actual story describing how this happens, how I leave the phone on the bench unattended, what I was doing when this occurred, right? So linking my setting and my introduction, right? Who I am, if I am the main character of the story, where I am, where the story takes place, usually probably in a park, right? Playing soccer with my friends. And then how this leads to me leaving my phone on the bench, perhaps carried away with the fun of the moment, being lost in the joy of playing soccer with my friends. And then at the end of that session, forgetting to retrieve my phone, right? That's in point number 2. Then I move up to the climax, right? The problem gets worse. I move to a different location to have lunch. I finish my meal happily with my friends. We're queuing up to pay. And that's when I realize that I have left my phone behind. My only method of payment for the meal, perhaps, right? The embarrassment, right? That feeling of just remorse and that feeling of confusion and not being able to find my phone, these make the problem I face worse, right? And then perhaps, right, in a very simple storyline, I could have at that very moment, as I'm at my most embarrassed and lost and flustered, right, someone running in, right, who has trailed me from the park and returns me my phone, a good Samaritan, overhearing perhaps the conversation I was having with the cashier who was waiting impatiently for me to pay the bill. perhaps overhearing the distress I was in and realizing that the phone she had found at the park on the bench belonged to me, right? And that perhaps leads us to our resolution, right? Where in this story, I learned the value of gratitude to this kind stranger, this good Samaritan, as well as that reflection that leads me to be more careful of my belongings and aware of my surroundings, right? So this is a very simplistic example of a story I might think about in my head and plan for about something that was lost. And at each section, I am thinking how I can connect that section to that idea of something being lost. Notice that all the way from the first section on exposition or introduction, I'm already thinking about the lunch where I'm going to realize that my phone is missing, right? So I build it in right from the first paragraph. Then in the second section or second paragraph, where the problem is introduced, here is where I insert my picture again, and I connect it again to the idea that I had lost my phone. I lost something very important to me, right? Then that moves on again to the idea that having lost my phone, this has consequences, right? What does the consequence mean? It means that I have to suffer, right, the embarrassment of not being able to pay for my meal. And that in turn moves over to the solution of the problem, where the kindness of a stranger here helps me by retrieving the phone, right? This woman finds my phone, or this man finds my phone on the park bench, and kind and considerate as they are, right, hold on to the phone. Perhaps they're on their way to the police station when they overhear this conversation between me and the cashier of the restaurant I am having lunch at. The fact that I'm not able to pay my bills because I have lost my phone, or I've left my phone behind in the park, right? And that's where they step up and return me my phone. That could be a possible solution. Again, all of these points revolve around the idea of something that was lost. So I'm always conscious of the fact that my story must be about something that was lost, how it was lost, how it was found. And in the end, the lesson I learned and the values perhaps that I managed to absorb from this experience, right? So I hope that this process will help you. And in the following practices that you will have with your teachers in class, I hope that you will develop that ability to make that connection very quickly and very accurately. Planning before writing should not be painful. You only need to spend between 2 to 5 minutes to make this connection, to write a quick jotted out plan of your story using the 5 points of the story mountain and making that connection between the picture and the rising action or the climax of the story in order to effectively keep your story on topic and on theme. That way, you will safely be able to navigate yourself to a content score of between 12 to 15. Of course, if you increase the interest level of your story, then you'll be able to score much better in your content. But for today's session, we are simply working on how you can keep your story relevant or on theme whenever you write. And I hope this process is helpful. Now, for those of you who are adventurous and you'd like to press on beyond this, and you'd like to think about how else you can make your content more relevant, how you can make your content repeat itself more effectively, I have an additional strategy for you. So stick around to find out if you have finished your exercise on identifying the theme, making the connection to the picture, and going through the process of sketching a simple story mountain of your ideas for the story that center around the theme. I'll give you a minute to finish that exercise with your teachers. You may pause the video and return to it for the next segment, a short one, on how you can further expand your content by using literal and figurative interpretations of the theme. Stay tuned. We talked about how we should always begin the approach of a question in composition by identifying and highlighting the theme, by constructing a simple story mountain around that theme, using the 5 points of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. We talked about how we should choose one, not two or three, but one picture and link it to the theme and rising action of our story mountain. It could also find its way into the climax, right? So the picture could be linked to the rising action or the climax of my story mountain. And then we talked about looking through all the sections of my story mountain, all 5, to make sure that my theme is connected to all of them and that nothing of what I'm writing is out of theme or out of point, right, of what the theme or topic is. And finally, at that point, to begin writing based on that story mountain that I've just very roughly constructed. Could be a simple sketch on my question paper. All right. So I hope that today's session has helped you to understand the process of linking the theme, the topic, the picture, and your story mountain planning together to create a cohesive story that's coherent. Coherent in this case meaning relevant, so that every idea and every word you put into your story leads to a very clear outcome. The outcome being the theme or the subject of your writing. Thank you very much for your kind attention, everybody, and I hope that this was helpful. I'll see you again in session 2, where we'll talk a little bit more about content building. Goodbye, everyone. Now, many of you will understand that there are 2 ways to look at the theme. I'm going to use 2 words to help you understand these 2 ways of looking at the theme. These 2 words are literal and figurative. Now, what do they mean? When we talk about something that's literal, we're talking about something that we take at face value. We look at the words at their most basic level, and we just make sense of them as they are. For example, something that was lost, meaning you lost something. Literally, something that you lost, a wallet, a phone, some money. That physical object that was lost can be one way of looking at the theme. For example, in the previous story mountain that we just did together, and the following story mountains that your teachers have gone through with you, you would probably have identified specific things that were lost, right? Or specific things that were special, right? If you did the theme or the topic on a special gift. But you understand actually that the words something that was lost could also refer to something that is not a physical object, or in this case, that is figurative, right? Something that is an idea or a feeling, something you cannot touch with your hands, something that is intangible, right? So, for example, someone can feel lost. That feeling of not knowing what to do, that feeling of not being familiar with a place, that feeling of not being able to find your way or do something that's required of you could also be something that was lost. In this case, that something or someone is you. You were lost. You were lost in a situation or circumstance. Or it could be something you lost that represents a feeling that you cannot touch with your hands, like friendship. Could friendship be something that you lost? Yes, very much so. You could lose friendship with someone, and that's not something you can touch or feel with your hands like a wallet or a phone, but it still is something that you lost. So that's another way of looking at the theme. So if we could somehow combine these 2 ways into our story, then we would be able to have twice as much to write about. For example, how perhaps the loss of something, losing something, led to losing friendship with someone. Perhaps someone lent us a precious object of theirs. We lost it, were irresponsible with it, and as a result, lost the friendship that we had with that person. So if I combine both the physical or the literal together with the figurative or the intangible, then I may have more to write about in my story. And I will give you an example here. So let's say I use the same idea of something that was lost. Notice here in the climax, I can make it twice as bad by mentioning the fact that I lost my phone and that the phone itself, right, represented my parents' trust in me because it was a graduation gift from them, recognizing that I was now old enough to handle a mobile phone. And the fact that I had lost it would now not just be about the physical phone, but also about losing the trust of my parents. Does that make sense to you? I hope it does, right? So I can double the loss. In this case, I'm not just losing a physical phone, I'm losing the trust and I'm losing that sense of responsibility that my parents have always seen in me. So the loss is double. I've lost something twice. I've lost the phone and I've lost the trust of my parents. Now, teachers and readers will appreciate how your story is even more interesting, intriguing, and complex because your problem has essentially doubled. And the more problems or the more problematic your story is, the more interesting it will be when that problem is finally solved. So that's something that you might want to use when you develop your content, right? That's a bonus tip for today. If you've managed to finish our basic exercises on connecting between the theme, the picture, and your writing in planning for it in Story Mountain. So let me show you an example of a literal loss of an item. So clutching his empty pocket in horror, Kenneth groaned in dismay. His faithful wallet, bulging with membership cards and precious notes from his friends, was conspicuously absent from his person. Kenneth slumped to the floor in utter dejection. Doomed. He was doomed. Notice how Kenneth has lost a physical object. That's right, this is a wallet. So this is a literal interpretation of the theme, something that was lost. Now let's look at a figurative interpretation of that same theme. Now let's look at the second example. Kenneth was paralyzed by the thought. Notice how this is a continuation of the story. Kenneth was paralyzed by the thought of how helpless he was without his trusty wallet. As he recalled the moments he would read the encouraging notes in his wallet to keep his spirits up, tears welled up unbidden in his eyes. What would he do? Where was his wallet? Millions of unanswered questions swarmed his mind as he surveyed his surroundings, feeling utterly lost and confused. Right, so notice here that the loss is no longer about the wallet. It's about the memories and the sentimental feeling that Kenneth experiences whenever he reads the notes that are in that wallet. So it's about the memories. It's about the importance of those notes to him that now are lost forever, making Kenneth feel extremely dejected. All right, so notice how the loss of a physical object can lead to the loss of an emotional one, right? That feeling of connection to those notes that Kenneth kept in his wallet. I hope that this is something that you can use in your stories as you write, because these are things that will add interest to your stories that readers will appreciate as they read it to see how you built it into your stories, right? So here's another example that you might want to try to combine all the ideas that we have covered today. Your teachers will show this to you, and there will be avenues for you to fill in your own stories and input. But let me summarize today's learning. Okay, we've covered the Story Mountain. We talked about how we should always begin the approach of a question in composition by identifying and highlighting the theme, by constructing a simple story mountain around that theme, using the 5 points of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. We talked about how we should choose one, not two or three, but one picture and link it to the theme and rising action of our story mountain. It could also find its way into the climax, right? So the picture could be linked to the rising action or the climax of my story mountain. And then we talked about looking through all the sections of my story mountain, all 5, to make sure that my theme is connected to all of them and that nothing of what I'm writing is out of theme or out of point, right? Of what the theme or topic is. And finally, at that point, to begin writing based on that story mountain that I've just very roughly constructed. Could be a simple sketch on my question paper. All right. So I hope that today's session has helped you to understand the process of linking the theme, the topic, the picture, and your story mountain planning together to create a cohesive story that's coherent. Coherent in this case meaning relevant, so that every idea and every word you put into your story leads to a very clear outcome. The outcome being the theme or the subject of your writing. Thank you very much for your kind attention, everybody, and I hope that this was helpful. I'll see you again in session 2, where we'll talk a little bit more about content building. Goodbye, everyone.